I'd like to welcome everyone here to this Bolshevik Tendency Forum, Russia's campaign to de-NATOize Ukraine. My name's Alan and I'll be chairing today. Firstly, to note that we are recording this meeting. That's not just the presentation, but the discussion as well. And we'll be publishing that as an audio file. So you don't have to worry about your picture being published online. The format will be Hans-Peter, who's going to present for the Bolshevik Tendency. He's the other one you can see on the screen. He's going to speak for about 45 minutes. Then we'll have a discussion round, and we'll come back with a summary by Hans-Peter at the end. We'll be aiming to go for about 2 hours in total. So this is a webinar, not just a meeting, which is a little bit different from a meeting in Zoom. So how the discussion works is if people can indicate with the raise hand function, which you should see down at the bottom of your screen, or you can write in the chat. I'll watch for that as well. I'll take people as I see them. When it is your turn to speak, you'll have a slight disconnection because I'll change you from attendee to a panelist, but nothing to worry about there. And then also when you're finished speaking, you'll go back. There'll be another disconnection as you go back to being an attendee. You've got the option to turn on your video or not as you choose. If you do want to make a contribution but don't even want to speak, you can just write it in the chat and I'll read it out for you. And I think that's about it. So I'll hand over to Hans-Peter, who's now going to give a introduction.
Yeah. Hi, Hans-Peter speaking. As Alan said, the topic today is Russia's campaign to de-NATOize Ukraine. And I hope I can get it in a more compressed time than 45 minutes, but let's see how fast I can go. On the 23rd of February of this year, Russia began its special military operation in Ukraine. It was preceded by decades of NATO eastward expansion, aimed at turning the countries of the former Warsaw Pact into US allies as a first step towards balkanizing the Russian state into several more easily controlled entities. In 1990, during negotiations surrounding the opening of the Berlin Wall in Germany, US Foreign Minister James Baker promised the last president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, that NATO wouldn't expand 1 inch eastward if Gorbachev sold out the East German deformed worker state to West German imperialism. The counter-revolution, which overturned the Soviet degenerated worker state in 1991, brought Boris Yeltsin to power, who opened up Russia's economy to Western corporations, resulting in a shocking decline in life expectancy and a dramatic 50% contraction of Russia's GDP. However, the triumph of capitalist restoration was not enough for the so-called free world imperialists. In September 1997, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's virulently Russophobic former national security advisor, penned an article in the magazine Foreign Affairs in which he proposed to get rid of the so-called Russian threat once and for all by breaking up Russia's territory into 5 separate countries. As a first step, Brzezinski proposed NATO eastward expansion, brazenly disregarding the promises made to Gorbachev. Brzezinski's perspective was not only shared by other prominent US leaders like Dick Cheney, but also some circles of the German military apparatus. In 2003, NATO reached Russia's border when the Baltic states joined. And in 2006, NATO stationed anti-missile systems in Poland and Romania, supposedly to intercept Iranian missiles, but everyone knew that Russia was the real target. What was not publicized in the Western press was that these missile defense systems can also be equipped with nuclear warheads. So they were hardly exclusively defensive in nature. The April 2008 NATO conference held in Bucharest proposed to invite Ukraine and Georgia to join the imperialist alliance. This emboldened Georgia's president Mikhail Saakashvili, who ordered his army recently equipped with modern NATO and Israeli weapons to begin military operations against the breakaway provinces of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which resulted in casualties not only among South Ossetian citizens, but also Russian peacekeeping troops. The Putin government, which considered NATO membership of Georgia and Ukraine to be a red line for Russian security, reacted by swiftly invading Georgia and smashing its military. Vladimir Putin replaced Yeltsin in 1999 and ended the open door policy for Western corporations by introducing tariffs and providing state support for those few industries which were internationally competitive: energy, steel, agricultural products, and arms. Western capital resented these measures and rendered Putin a reactionary Bonapartist great Russian chauvinist, who in the early 2000s proposed that Russia should join NATO, a persona non grata in European and North American capitals. While Russia was able to chart a somewhat independent course politically, its economy remained that of a dependent capitalist country. Its primary source of income consists in the sale of oil and gas, and in many cases it had to rely on Western technology to extract it. Its economic relationship with the former Soviet republics has by and large not been characterized by extracting imperialist extra profits, but rather by selling energy at below world market prices, i.e. subsidizing them. Russia's military might, inherited from the Soviet times, has posed a formidable challenge to the US, as was demonstrated in its successful intervention to thwart NATO's support for the overthrow of the Ba'athist regime in Syria. In an ominous development, US strategists decided to walk away in 2019 from the intermediate nuclear missile treaty with Russia, with the intent of reducing the distance of NATO nuclear weapons from Moscow. The prospect of having NATO nuclear weapons positioned right at its borders would pose a huge threat to Moscow, since its systems, established to detect a nuclear first strike, would be unable to do so if a first strike was launched from Ukrainian territory or the Baltic statelets. The Trump administration's opposition to the intermediate nuclear treaty was in part guided by its plans to encircle China by stationing such weapons in countries allied with Washington. The Chinese deformed worker state has thus far disappointed Western expectations that the introduction of market measures and the emergence of a new capitalist class would automatically result in capitalist counter-revolution. Instead, for over 4 decades, China's economy has expanded swiftly and made impressive technological progress. During the global capitalist crisis of 2008, as the imperialist countries contracted, as the imperialist economies contracted, China's continued to grow at an impressive rate. The People's Republic, not Russia, is the prime strategic target of America's increasingly unhinged and desperate campaign to defend its place in the sun by military means. But whilst the Trump administration focused on China, Joe Biden considered a military economic defeat of Russia as a necessary stepping stone to contain China and ultimately reduce it to the neo-colonial status it escaped through the social revolution of 1949, which overturned capitalist rule. Biden continued the policy of the Obama administration in seeking to use Ukraine as a stick with which to poke the Russian bear. The US supported the 2014 Maidan coup against Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, who had attempted to play the EU off against Russia. Whilst the EU Ascension Treaty offered an IMF austerity package combined with a sweetener of $100 million, of a loan of $100 billion US dollars, $10 billion US dollars, Putin offered $15 billion in loans with few strings and a promise of continued energy subsidies. Yanukovych's acceptance of Moscow's offer resulted in protests of Western Ukrainians who wanted to join the EU. The protests quickly took on a violent character as fascist militants of the Svoboda Party and the right sector spearheaded a coup which brought a government into power that had been handpicked by Washington. One of the first manifestations of the ultranationalist influence within the new government was the abrogation of legal recognition of Russian as an official language in a country in which some 40% of the population are Russian speakers. The integration of the fascists into Ukraine's state repressive apparatus and the banning of Russian as an official language alienated areas in which much of the population identified as ethnically Russian, such as Crimea, in the Donbass, and Lugansk. In these regions, large majorities of the population expressed their will to become part of Russia. Putin was prepared to incorporate Crimea, but was only willing to offer military assistance to the breakaway People's Republics in Donetsk and Lugansk to fend off attacks by the Kiev regime. Whilst the Putin government was prepared to seek a peaceful resolution via the Minsk Accords, which traded a degree of autonomy to these provinces for requiring that they remain within the Ukrainian state, the other parties to the negotiations, Germany, France, and the Kiev regime, viewed them as a means to buy time for the Ukrainian military to be upgraded by NATO to the point that they could forcibly reintegrate these territories. Former German Chancellor Angela Merkel spelled this out in a recent interview. Kiev never intended to implement the peace accords and instead sought to reconquer the breakaway territories in a conflict that by early 2022 had taken 14,000 lives, 89% of which were among the people of the Donbas republics. When Volodymyr Zelensky got voted into power in May 2019, after campaigning on a promise to implement the Minsk Accords, he was brazenly told by the leader of the right sector, Dmytro Yarosh, that he would be hung from a tree if he tried. When Zelensky traveled to Zolota, a town on Kiev's side of the front line in October 2019, to convince the regime's forces there, mostly composed of outright fascists, to stop their shelling of the People's Republics, he was told to leave. But rather than bringing the Azov Battalion and various other fascist formations to heel for ignoring the president's wishes, Yarosh was promoted to become a top advisor to the Ukrainian army's commander-in-chief Valery Zaluzhny in November 2021. This illustrates the influence the fascists wielded within the Ukrainian state apparatus after the Maidan coup. Until roughly 2020, this was widely acknowledged in the Western mainstream media. In mid-February 2022, the Ukrainian military had amassed an army of 60,000, with which they expected to be able to reconquer Donetsk and Lugansk. Observers of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe recorded that in the days before the Russian incursion began, the shelling by the Ukrainian army of the two breakaway regions intensified. In December 2021, Putin proposed treaties to both NATO and the US as a last-ditch attempt to reach a diplomatic solution in the conflict in Ukraine and NATO's eastward expansion. The Kremlin proposed the withdrawal of the missile installations in Poland and Romania, the actual implementation of the Minsk Accords, a withdrawal of NATO forces to the borders of 1997, and a guarantee that NATO would never accept Ukraine as a member. The Russian proposals were ignored, as Putin doubtless expected. After all, Adam Schiff, Democratic chairman of the US House Intelligence Committee, described Russia in January 2020, 2 years before the Russian incursion into Ukraine, as a quote-unquote wounded animal, and bluntly proclaimed that, quote-unquote, the United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here. By the time Moscow intervened in Ukraine, all diplomatic avenues had been exhausted. NATO and Kiev considered that the brutal attacks of Ukrainian ethno-nationalists on Ukraine's Russian-speaking population would provoke Russia into invading Ukraine in order to rush to their defense. This hoped the strategies of the so-called rules-based international order would lead to a prolonged conflict with the aim, in the words of German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, of ruining Russia. The rules of the so-called rules-based international order are written by large imperialist corporations who seek to enforce a regime of profit maximization to their benefit internationally, involving the use of force if governments of dependent capitalist countries dare implement policies domestically that run counter the multinationals' ability to generate imperialist extra profits. The motive for the conflict with Putin's Russia is to return its economy to the conditions of the Yeltsin years, when Western corporations had a free hand, and to remove it as a potential point of support for other targets of Washington and its allies. By far the most important of these is the Chinese deformed worker state, where economic decisions are not primarily guided by profit maximization, and foreign investment is closely controlled. As a result of these policies, the dictatorial Stalinist bureaucracy in Beijing, which monopolizes political decision-making, has been able to dramatically lift hundreds of millions of workers and peasants out of abject poverty and turn China into the workshop of the world. China's spectacular economic rise and growing technological sophistication has permitted Beijing to undertake the ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, which has been undermining the debt trap policies of the IMF and the World Bank internationally. The attempt to portray the increasingly hysterical attacks by the imperialist powers on Russia and China as a struggle between democracy and autocracy does not impress many in the semi-colonial world. The refusal of the ruling capitalist elites of Africa, Latin America, and Asia to sign on to Washington's sanctions against Russia reflects their awareness that a military victory for NATO, US, and its Ukrainian proxy in the current conflict will enable new aggressive attacks by the imperial predators, who in recent decades have laid waste to many less developed countries, including Somalia, Serbia, Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan. Conversely, a military victory for Russia over NATO in Ukraine will strengthen the position of Iran, Venezuela, Nicaragua, as well as the Cuban, North Korean, Vietnamese, and Chinese deformed worker states. Washington's America First policy has been accompanied by economic sanctions against Moscow, which have come at the expense of America's imperialist allies in Europe, particularly Germany, whose industrial might has relied on access to cheap energy imports from the Soviet Union and its successor since the 1950s. Most other countries in West Europe have some degree of dependence on oil and gas from their eastern neighbor, and all are paying a horrendous price for the quadrupling of energy costs resulting from the US-imposed sanctions against Russia. After the end of the Cold War, access to low-wage but well-educated Eastern European workers by means of EU eastward expansion and cheap Russian energy turned the German bourgeoisie into an imperialist power with a similar standing to Japan in the US-dominated capitalist world order. Europe's increasing inclination toward deepening economic integration into China's Belt and Road Initiative led to concerns in America's ruling class that Germany might seek to pursue its own imperial interests by turning east, a prospect that has worried British and US rulers since the early 20th century. The Trump administration sanctioned the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project in late 2019, which threatened the substantial investments made by multiple European corporations. The sanctions were intended to impede the development of economic links between Germany and Russia. On the 7th of February 2022, only weeks before the outbreak of hostilities in Ukraine, US President Joe Biden told German Chancellor Olaf Scholz that should Russian tanks move into Ukraine, Nord Stream 2 would not progress. Asked by an astonished reporter how that was possible, considering that the project was not under US control, Biden responded that, quote unquote, "we will be able to do it." On the 26th of September, not only Nord Stream 2, but also Nord Stream 1 were blown up. No one took credit for this, and while Western media immediately and absurdly accused Russia of having done it, a suggestion as credible as Kiev's repeated claims that Russia has been shelling the nuclear power plant it controls in Zaporozhye US President of State Antony Blinken described the event as, quote unquote, a tremendous opportunity. What Blinken meant by that was that the destruction of the pipelines opened the door for the US to supply the far more expensive liquefied natural gas to the Europeans at prices 4 times what Russia charged. When Sarah Wagenknecht, a German parliamentary deputy of the bourgeois workers' party Die Linke, lodged a formal inquiry regarding Berlin's investigation of the Nord Stream sabotage, she was told by the German government that, quote unquote, further information cannot be provided, even in a classified form, for reasons of the welfare of the state, end of quote. The Kremlin claims that the British were behind the attack, noting that then Prime Minister Liz Truss texted Antony Blinken minutes after the incident from her personal mobile phone, "It's done." British imperialism, dramatically weakened by economic decline, is desperate for a free trade agreement with the US. We don't know who was behind the attack on Nord Stream, but it is obvious that if it was not the US acting directly, it was carried out by one of its close allies. German economic think tanks are warning that the sanctions placed on Russian energy by the EU and NATO states will soon lead to a deindustrialization of Germany. All its leading sectors, such as automobiles, manufacturing equipment, chemicals, and electronics, are directly impacted by the steep energy price rises. To compound this, in August this year, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides subsidies of over $400 billion for industries involved with the green transition if they are based in the United States. This is already attracting industries from Europe, South Korea, and Japan. The website Politico, in an article published on the 24th of November, cites a high-ranking EU official as, quote unquote, the fact is, if you look at it soberly, the country that is most profiting from this war is the US, because they are selling more gas and at higher prices, and because they are selling more weapons. We are really at a historical juncture, end of quote, the senior EU official said, arguing that the double hit of trade disruption from US subsidies and higher energy prices risks turning public opinion against both the war effort and the transatlantic alliance. Another quote from the EU official, America needs to realize that public opinion is shifting in many EU countries, end of quote. Revolutionaries do not take sides in inter-imperialist conflicts such as that between the US and leading EU countries, but we are not neutral in cases of imperialist attacks on less developed countries. Last May Day, our comrades participated in demonstrations in London and Toronto under the slogan, NATO war drive against China and Russia hurts workers everywhere. At that point, we were the only international Trotskyist tendency to call for a military victory for Russia, although we have been recently joined by the internationalist group, which, like ourselves, was founded by cadre from the formerly Revolutionary Spartacist League. The war in Ukraine and the sanctions have negatively impacted working-class living standards internationally. The US national security strategy boasts that sanctioned Russian corporations have been forced to, quote unquote, fire a third of their employees. But the impact of the NATO sanctions is mostly being felt right at home, as millions of workers and poor people in the imperialist countries struggling with rising energy costs and accompanying inflationary surge will be forced to decide this winter whether it is worse to freeze or to starve. Berlin has been establishing warmth shelters in anticipation that plenty of people won't be able to pay their skyrocketing energy bills. Governments across Europe have been warning of possible electricity outages, the impacts of which are likely to be devastating. On the 5th of November, at a cost of living crisis demonstration in London, attended by tens of thousands, our comrades carried placards proclaiming, "Anti-Russian sanctions cause price increases, lift them now." While protesting the cost of living crisis, most of the international left have had little to say about the fact that the problem is rooted in anti-Russian sanctions and the imperialist proxy war in which Ukraine is being used as a battering ram against Russia. The majority of self-described revolutionaries who echo Washington's talking points about Russian imperialism are prepared to concede that Russia's economy is weak and that the current conflict in Ukraine was provoked by NATO, not Putin. While they claim that Russia is imperialist in the Leninist sense, they are unable to identify those countries from which the Russian oligarchs supposedly extract imperialist super profits. Such people are generally impressionists who are not overly concerned about questions of Marxist theory. If they were, they might wonder why Lenin described Portugal, despite its role as colonial power controlling Angola, Mozambique, Guinea, and other territories, not as an imperialist country, but rather as a British trade colony. The answer to this question, which must forever remain a riddle to those who place Russia in the imperialist category, is that overall, Portugal was not an exploiting, but an exploited country. Whilst the rulers in Lisbon managed to extract some super profits from the African countries, these were insufficient to offset its own exploitation by Britain in its net economic relationship with the world. Those leftists who describe Russia as imperialists are generally motivated by some combination of confusion and opportunist adaptation to bourgeois pressure. They fear that militarily siding with Russia might risk being identified with Putin's reactionary Bonapartist regime. Those self-professed Trotskyist formations that acknowledge the reality of Russia's dependent capitalist status, but refuse to take sides against NATO and its Ukrainian proxy, are fairly obviously motivated by capitulation to the Russophobic hysteria that has been saturated the mainstream capitalist media and infected the milieus from which they seek to recruit. Self-identified revolutionaries who equate Russia with the imperialist West and its Nazi-infested Ukrainian puppet regime, or even designated a greater evil, are unable to account for the direct connection between the attacks on working-class living standards at home and the sanctions imposed on Russian energy exports. Marxists have the task of explaining the complex realities of the Ukrainian conflict to the working class in order to lay the basis for undertaking future struggles. It seems likely that the military situation will turn decisively to Russia's favor in the coming months. The Zelensky regime, as the irresponsible puppet of its masters in Washington and Berlin, throws away the lives of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian workers and continues a conflict which is laying waste to the homeland in a struggle to regain territory whose majority population no longer wants to be part of the Ukrainian state. Trotskyists defend the right of the peoples of Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk, and other regions in Ukraine to decide their own future, including the right to join Russia. Until Western and Central Ukraine have severed their link to NATO, the indisputable right to national self-determination must be subordinated to the necessity to terminate the NATO connection, which is primarily designed as an instrument of imperialist aggression against dependent capitalist Russia. Zelensky's opting out of peace negotiations last April, in accordance with instructions relayed by then Prime Minister of Britain, Boris Johnson, reveals him as the enemy of the Ukrainian workers whose national interests he claims to represent. The only historically progressive role for Ukrainian workers lies through turning the guns around and toppling the deeply corrupt and Nazi-infested Zelensky regime. Such a struggle could provide a powerful impetus for Russian workers to assert their own historic interests by mobilizing to overturn Putin and the avaricious oligarchic capitalist order he represents. Trotskyists in Ukraine must defend the right of Russian-speaking areas to secede if the majority of their populations so wish, and oppose the venomous genocidal nationalism spouted by the various fascist and ultranationalist elements. It is also necessary to fight to restore the trade union rights gutted by Zelensky, to lift the ban on all oppositional political parties, while mobilizing to smash the fascist organizations which permeate much of Ukraine's state apparatus. Marxists side militarily with the Putin regime in this conflict, without prettifying its reactionary Bonapartist and socially conservative character, or providing a blank check to all actions the Russian military may undertake, such as the brutalization of Ukraine's civilian population. While we opposed the strikes of Belarusian railway workers refusing to ship weaponry to Russian troops in the front line, we are certainly not opposed to workers in Russia or Belarus striking in industries that play no direct part in Moscow's war effort. Whilst we advocate for a Russian military victory against NATO and its proxies, we must also make clear that the Russian capitalist government is fundamentally opposed to the interests of working people at home and abroad. Russian Marxists must argue for the revolutionary socialist overthrow of the Putin government by Russian workers as part of his perspective of international socialist revolution. Revolutionaries in the imperialist countries of North America and Europe support strikes to impede NATO weapon shipments to Ukraine, like those undertaken by Italian and Greek workers earlier this year. We advocate lifting the anti-Russian sanctions and uphold Wilhelm Liebknecht's slogan, "Not $1, not one dime for the imperialist military," for NATO's war effort. As inflation rages and the economic crisis deepens, Marxists seek to forge class struggle formations within the mass organizations of the working class, capable of linking struggles for bare necessities in the inevitable sharpening class battles with the historical necessity to fight for working class power and the expropriation of the capitalist class domestically and internationally. This is the only means to open the road for the peaceful socialist development that can provide secure and comfortable existence for humanity as a whole. It is this perspective to which the Bolshevik tendency is committed.
Thank you, Hans-Peter. Well inside the 45 minutes. So that gives us a good amount of time for discussion. For people who didn't hear my initial comments, we're going to go for about 2 hours in total. So that's about just under another hour and a half. So we're going to have a discussion round now. And just for people who are not used to the webinar feature of Zoom, how we're going to do that is if you indicate with the raised hand option, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen there, hopefully, or you can indicate in the chat, and I'll watch out there for people who want to speak who can't find the raised hand. There'll be a short disconnection when I change you from an attendee to a panelist, where you appear on the screen. If you don't want to have your video on, you don't have to. We are recording this, but we're only going to make an audio version of the presentation and the discussion available when we publish it. So you don't have to worry about your video being all over the internet. But if you also don't even want to speak, you can write a presentation in the chat and I'll read it out for you. So I've got a couple of people to speak already. So I've got Dara followed by John. So I'll just promote Dara there. Given the number of people, I think and the amount of time we've got, I'm going to indicate after 3 minutes, and if people can try and finish after 4 minutes. That should give it enough time for everyone. Okay, Dara, are you ready to go?
Yeah.
Great.
Thanks. Okay. Yeah, I just kind of wanted to start off the discussion round by kind of talking about the roots of the conflict. And I think for many of us as revolutionaries, we can trace the roots of this conflict back to the triumph of counter-revolution in 1991 in the USSR. It is extremely disappointing. The majority of the self-proclaimed revolutionary left have failed to identify this as the newest stage in a long-term geopolitical goal of US imperialism to lock the economies of the former USSR more tightly into a subordinate position within the global capitalist division of labor, and thereby increasing the flow of wealth into the US and other imperialist states. I think looking back at the 2008 standoff with NATO-trained Georgian troops, which our former comrades claimed actually signaled the emergence of Russia as an imperialist power, it seems that it became clear to the Russian ruling class that it was entirely conceivable that while the US wasn't committed to putting their own boots on the ground, a much larger future conflict could lead to that, if not a much larger endeavor of financing and training of proxy to do their dirty work for them. I think it's quite telling that in 2008, the Russian officer corps were apparently very disappointed with how they'd done on kind of low-scale infantry tactics, finding that NATO-trained troops were actually far more flexible in the field, until they brought armored columns in. But that was clearly a kind of a signal to Putin's regime. So they've clearly been preparing their own military to deal with any proxy force that US imperialism and others could throw their way. Yeah, so I really just wanted to point out the whole role that Ukraine is playing as a proxy, and in furthering the US objective since 1991, in trying to repeat the plunder of the 90s in Russia, under what could be considered a puppet, Yeltsin. But I mean, apparently in 4 years, the average Ukrainian workers—
1 minute to go.
Yeah, thanks. The average Ukrainian workers' gas bill went up by over 1,000%. And between 2014 and 2020, it not only quadrupled, but at the time it multiplied by something like 14, because they were buying gas that was still Russian, but they had to buy it through a Western intermediary. Yeah, that's all from me. Thanks. Finish.
Okay, I've got John next. I'll just promote you to panelist. You'll have a brief disconnection as that happens. Okay, John, you just want to unmute yourself? Great. There you go.
Okay, thank you. Hans, that was a well-prepared presentation, and many good observations in it that showed you got a clear understanding of and demonstrated it to us. I'm wondering if it'd be possible for you to share the text that you read out to us as a document. That'd be good. Secondly, I'd like to make a couple of observations. First of all, the US imposed sanctions regime seems to me to be harming the Europeans. It's not having a particularly harmful effect on the US, but it is having a harmful effect on the Europeans. the harm that might be intended to be having on Russia, I think is sometimes exaggerated. The Russian economy, to me, seems to be quite strong. If you look at the exchange rate, for instance, the ruble is higher than it's been for years, and so Russian people are able to spend and are in quite comfortable positions, and in terms of their economic position. The effect of US imperialism is directly to steal and seems to me from what's going on is to steal German corporations from Germany and transplant them to the US, where they can be more expected to be able to guarantee energy supplies. We've seen this happening, and it seems that again, it's Europeans who are suffering economically. If these businesses transfer to the US, they'll end up becoming US businesses, and again, weakening Western Europe. Okay, so as far as the conflict is going in Ukraine, again, as I see it, the Ukrainians are sacrificing tens of thousands, if not 100,000 men so far in this conflict, and tactically trying to defend ground and sacrificing many more on an almost daily basis, hundreds, most days.
1 minute.
And thank you, and vastly outmanned and outgunned by the Russians. So I think that what's going to happen in the near future is we're going to have the breakup of Ukraine, Russia controlling one half, and Poland will go in and take the western end. Thank you. Just some thoughts.
Thank you, John. I'll be demoting you to attendee again. We've got one other person indicating to speak so far, and that's Jason. I'll just promote you to a panelist, Jason.
Okay, thank you, Al. An important element of the war has been the propaganda campaign. Here within the US, the mainstream media has blanketed the public with atrocity propaganda reminiscent of the beastly Hun campaign that occurred in the Anglophone countries during World War I. In a similar way, I think we can see it being employed to vilify Russians as brutal and barbarian. Campaigns to instill hatred of the enemy are, of course, normal wartime practice, but there's been a steady increase in the gullibility of left liberal opinion. From the butcher of Baghdad to the Mujahideen to Putin, every US act of imperial aggression this century has drawn more and more ostensible leftists into the role of State Department socialists. While Telesur posted a photo essay of a meat plant turned Ukrainian neo-Nazi prison and torture chamber, and despite Amnesty International's reports of Adar battalion atrocities against captive Russian separatists at the Lugansk People's Republic, the LPR, the US media has obsessively reported on these discovered dungeons as being Russian dungeons in the Ukraine. Attempts to minimize the prevalence of fascist violence are then uncritically echoed in the press of the US Social Democrats, such as Jacobin and Dissent, with firsthand reports from ostensible Ukrainian freedom fighters. The Adar battalion was officially incorporated into the Ukrainian military in 2016, despite doctors at hospitals having filed reports with Ukrainian police based on the patients they had treated who had been tortured but ultimately released from captivity in these neo-Nazi run prisons. Similarly, CNN seems to be recycling on at least a monthly basis allegations of mass Russian rape campaigns of Ukrainian women. Obviously, sexual violence is all too often a component of the horrors of war, and no doubt the allegations have traction because of the widely known instances of sexual violence directed at German women in territories occupied by the Soviet military at the end of World War II. But of course, recognizing the prevalence of such incidents during times of war in no way implies revolutionaries ought to do anything other than condemn such heinous acts. What's interesting about these reports, and no doubt reflective of how hard it is to clamp down on access to alternative news sources via the internet, is that each of the articles I've seen on CNN then reports the victims approaching Russian officers to press charges, and that the accused rapists were subject to investigation and prosecutions or discipline. For instance, a November 3rd CNN report quoted one victim as stating of her alleged rapist, his commander, quote, found the head of his unit. He came to see me and told me, I punished him severely. I broke his jaw, but the most severe punishment is a head, like shooting. The commander asked me, do you mind this? I said, I don't mind. I wish all of them will be shot. Slander that while the jaw-breaking commanding officers do make the Russians sound like some rather savage and Spartan, I'm not sure this reads as pejoratively as the State Department presumably hopes it does. I'm not sure the public doesn't read this as a few bad apples, and that those carrying out such atrocities might not be rogue actors defying official military policy. Slander that the Russian military was distributing Viagra to troops has notably been exposed and debunked. Finally, and more ominously, CNN and other mainstream media sites have been, since at least October, running numerous articles on the potential for conflict to develop in a nuclear direction. These reports, often quoting retired or active US military officers, serve to normalize and acclimatize Americans to the idea that nuclear conflict could be minimized or survivable, which is absurd. While the US line, as captured in such pieces as this one in CNN, a step just short of a nuclear attack on Ukraine, though what one source described as a nuclear display, such as a potential military strike on a nuclear power plant or the detonation of nuclear devices at high altitude or away from populated areas, we should read these as nothing less than trial balloons and no less than veiled threats, just as Nixon's statements during Vietnam that we are not using the great power that could finish off North Vietnam in an afternoon, and we will not. Thank you. Thanks, Alan.
Thanks, Jason. I'll just demote you.
Yep.
So far, we don't have any other people indicating to speak. You feel free to just ask a question. You don't have to speak for a full 4 minutes. I have someone. I have Christoph. I'll just promote you. Just unmute yourself. Okay, go.
Yes, hi there. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Democratic Socialists of America, who are, as some people might know, the largest socialist organization in the States. And as such, of course, it is somewhat interesting to see how they responded to this conflict. Well, just a few days after the special military operations commenced, the DSA issued a statement in which they condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine as, quote, extreme and asymmetrical escalation. So when Russia reacts to the fact that they're encircled by NATO arms and troops and an aggressive Ukrainian regime, the response by Russia is labeled as extreme and asymmetrical escalation, a rather unusual, shall we say, interpretation of the situation. In order not to sound completely pro-NATO, they added on in their statement that they were for an end of imperialist expansionism that set the stage for this conflict. One wishes they had explored that line of thought a little bit more. They might have come up with something better than their denunciation of the Russian invasion. So, of course, the DSA are aligned with the Democrats, and they have 4 members in Congress. When all the Democrats voted for the $40 billion aid package or war package for Ukraine, the DSA members in Congress, like Alexander Ocasio-Cortez, went along with it and voted for this Ukrainian war package by the US Congress. So one might wonder, what is it actually that these so-called socialists do in opposition to the US war through NATO against Russia? Well, they write a letter. That's what they do. That's all they did, really. So in October, 30 members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which includes the DSA people like AOC, issued a letter to Biden in which they called for direct talks with Russia to end the war, while at the same time applauding the US war effort, of course. So the suggestion of talking to Russia was kind of the high point of opposition from these people in Congress. This immediately drew a critical response from many Democrats who basically said that this letter was undermining the effort of the Democrats in the upcoming midterm elections. It was bad for their electoral efforts. So what did they do? They retracted this letter.
1 minute.
So even a very, very soft letter calling on talks with Russia was too much. And in an added irony, they actually blamed the release as well as the retraction of the letter on staff members rather than taking responsibility for themselves. So what we're seeing really is how members of DSA are in line with the Democrats when they talk about, you know, we are for Ukraine because we want to uphold Ukrainian self-determination. The problem is Ukraine is acting as a proxy of US imperialism. And as such, you can't really talk about a just war of national liberation when they are literally the mercenaries of US imperialism. But that unfortunately is the line of DSA, and that's how they justify what is essentially support to Ukraine and US imperialism. So I leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Christoph. I'll just switch you back to being an attendee. We don't have anyone indicating they'd like to speak. Oh, yes, we do. Tom, I'll just promote you. Yeah, you can just unmute yourself. Okay, when you're ready.
Hi. I think it's very clear that the current proxy war, as Hoppe indicated, is going to end with a Russian victory. I think it's difficult to be certain what the time frame of that is, and probably has a lot to do with the Russian military planning that we're not privy to. Russian victory, of course, is going to mean a NATO defeat, and it will also almost certainly involve the removal of Zelensky's puppet regime. What's not so clear, though, is whether this is going to be achieved through a political settlement, one which would presumably establish a regime that Moscow is comfortable with, could live with, which would be running a shrunken but more ethnically homogeneous Ukraine in central and western Ukraine. Possibly it might involve, as John speculated, a Polish-run puppet government. That I think is not entirely clear. That's probably also going to be determined, I would assume, by Moscow's preferences. And they're historically not too congruent with Polish foreign policy, usually, but anything's possible. Or the other option would be that there could be a sort of Chechen settlement, which could be very ugly period of extended iron fist repression, eventually ending up with what Moscow would regard as a suitably stable puppet regime. But what's clear is that when the fighting ends, the world seems, in any case at this point, is likely to look a lot different than it did when the fighting commenced last February. And that's because the sun is setting on the American century, pretty obviously. The institutions that were established, run out of New York and Washington at the end of World War II, are no longer capable of running a unitary capitalist world order. Instead, we're going to have a multipolar world, as the Chinese and Russians and others have talked about it. And that means a world in which the US and its allies and vassals are no longer hegemonic. The dawning, though, of a multipolar world, I think we should understand, is not something that's going to be, it's not going to be an age of Aquarius. It's not going to be an age of peace and friendship among all peoples, although sometimes it's advertised that way by some of its advocates. It's going to be a period where there's a lot of uncertainty, and there will be a lot of jostling, hopefully not a military sort, but quite possibly, between various powers that have different and in some cases historically established conflicts of interest. The most important elements in Eurasia, most important contenders are going to be China, Russia, India, and Iran, probably roughly in that order. But there are other powers that are capable of playing large roles in alliance or independently in that region, and that they would include, I mean, it's a huge region, obviously. Apart from Western Europe, it would include Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and elsewhere in Africa and in Latin America, there are similarly potentially ambitious capitalist regimes that would be looking to establish more influence than they currently have under the American setup. One of the big puzzles in all of this, which Hoppe discussed to some extent, is the willingness of the major imperialist powers in the EU, particularly, most importantly, Germany, but also France and others, to subordinate their interests to those of the fading US superpower. And the costs of this are becoming quite Hoppe outline. That's my time. Okay, I think that, let's say that I think it's reasonable to expect that there's going to be a major correction by the Germans and other West Europeans who have suffered the consequences of too much obedience to the US superpower. And that may be coming fairly shortly. There have been some intimations of that recently in the New York Times also, I would point out. That's my time, right?
Yep. Thanks, Tom. I'll just put you back to attendee. Then I've got Richard next to speak, and I'll promote him to panelist. Okay, Richard, if you can just unmute yourself.
I got to unmute.
Yeah, you're good.
Start the video. There you go.
Yeah, you're ready.
I'm a neophyte with this technology, even though I own a computer store for years. But my name is Rich, and I live in central Massachusetts in the States. And I was a proud capitalist for a lot of years. And then I realized what was going on. And I've been studying the last 4 or 5 years about Marxism and the chain of events. And it's been very, very interesting. I'm an historian by trade. And what I see is, we all know that the rank and file, the solidarity of all workers have to get on the same page to continue the Marxist surge, the progress that we're making. At the same time, I've learned that the end of capitalism is close by. And what happens? We're in a bell curve of socialism that we jump off on. Well, it takes a lot of effort. And I just want to give an example. I read in the New York Times recently that, and it's a quasi quote, today is ushering in a period of social and labor unrest not seen since at least the 1970s. And I believe that's the impetus for change. Okay. a revolution spurred on by the continuous growth of rank and file. Okay, and that's what I know about it. I could be wrong. This is just my viewpoint, you know, and I really believe in the fact that right now there's 629 labor unrest situations going on in the U.S., and I get that statistic from the ILR school at Cornell University. They track all the labor unrest at various locations, union unrest, and my idea is you know, the solidarity is there. If you take the John Deere strike that we had recently, they went out on strike. They had a, you know, they were out on strike, and what happened was the suppliers of parts for the tractors and stuff, the union shops, they went out on strike with them. They were sympathetic. So there's a bond there that if one company sees the injustice, then the rank and file of other companies in the same industry and in manufacturing are standing by to help. The other example I use is the Volvo truck strike. Okay, what I understand happened there is, we don't get into the nuances of the strike, but to get Belgium manufacturing plant in Belgium across the ocean, they were sympathetic to the strike as well. And so what we have here is a start, I believe, an impetus of and possibilities, not to wait another 60 or 80 years or 100 years, but to grow this, because it's happening now. And what I read just the other night, that, you know, we have to seize the opportunity and we have to be ready. We have to build our bell curve. So when the event of capitalist and imperialist fails and falls, because it can't go on the way it is. From what I know, thank you. What I know, it can't go on. So like I said, I believe an alliance of solidarity exists. And I'd like to start this by hypothetically saying the IWW, rank and file, workers on the shop floor, all together, no outsiders, the people that grind the steel. What if they all got together around the world and said, all right, you know, we're not going to make any more weapons to fight this war. And you know, you say, oh, well, can that happen? Yeah, it can happen, because it did happen when the longshoremen, stevedores, back in the Iraq war and stuff, refused to load or unload ships. Okay, and so the Iraqs that were attacked, their union paid homage to the unions at Long Beach, California, where the freight was. So if we look at what's happened just in the last few years, maybe 10 years, I think things are progressing right along, and we might want to, you know, come up with a plan or execute some of the plans that have been established. So that's all what I have to say, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Richard. I'll just bounce you back down to attendee. So you had that short disconnect again. Okay, we don't have anyone else indicating to speak just at the moment. I might just make a short report on something that happened here in Ireland where I live, which people might find interesting. That's okay with the meeting. So on Thursday in the past week, Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the EU Commission, who I'm sure people will know quite well, spoke at a special session of the Irish Parliament, of both lower and upper houses. She was basically just drumming up support, or continued support, by Ireland for the war against Ukraine. After she spoke, the leaders of the different parliamentary parties and the parliamentary blocs got to speak, and as part of that, the leader of the People for Profit parliamentary bloc, Richard Boyd Barrett, spoke. Richard Boyd Barrett is probably the leading socialist, self-described, in the Irish Parliament, and he has been a long time member of the Socialist Workers' Party. That's the Cliffites. So he spoke primarily to point out what he thought was hypocrisy on Ursula von der Leyen's part for not being willing to oppose the Israeli aggression against Palestinians or the Saudi Arabian war against Yemen, while she was quite willing to speak against the supposed war of Russia against Ukraine. However, during that, he said something quite interesting, because up to this point, People for Profit has taken a position of opposing Russia's intervention in Ukraine, but also seeing it as part of a wider inter-imperialist conflict between US, NATO, and Ukraine. However, Richard Boyd Barrett said the following: I also note that this week, the President, Ursula von der Leyen, has called, I support her in this, for a tribunal to be established to investigate the undoubted war crimes of Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. We all condemn the utterly barbaric and murderous invasion of Ukraine by Russia. We support the people of Ukraine in their struggle for self-determination. Later on, in his comments, he said, if we are to condemn, as we must, the war crimes of Putin, we must simultaneously condemn all war crimes and all crimes against humanity. And he went on to make his points about hypocrisy. However, I feel this stepped over something of a line, even for the People for Profit SWP opportunists, because that's pretty blatant support for this latest part of the EU, NATO, US aggression against Ukraine, that they want to have a special war crimes court just to deal with the supposed crimes of Russia in Ukraine. Not a word about US, NATO in his talk, not a word about the crimes of the Ukrainians, which actually predate the current war and go back to 2014, ever since when they've been attacking the civilian population in the Donbass. And I think it's a sign of a process. I can only imagine what it's like for people in the United States, but even here in Ireland, there is a continual repeating of all the lies about that this is nothing about US and NATO, that the poor Ukrainians, there are no fascists involved there, it's just all the nasty Russians. There's a huge amount of public pressure, and you can see that being expressed in this kind of capitulation by so-called socialists. And I think that it's important for those of us who stand in the Marxist tradition and understand what imperialism is and what the nature of this war is, to stand against that, to stand on the basis of the programmatic understanding, which leads us to our conclusions, and not to bow to popular opinion as expressed by the mass media. Thank you. Oh, I've got Harper indicating. Are you indicating you want to come? Oh, no, that's okay. Yeah. Roxy, you're already a panelist. Away
Thank you.
go.
Hi. I just wanted to talk a little bit about something that we're taking for granted at this meeting, which is that Russia is not imperialist. And, you know, no one else has brought it up. But actually, when we go and talk to other people on the left, it's actually the discussion that comes up the most. It's one of the biggest differences between us and the majority of the left, how you actually define an imperialist state. And it's so important because obviously our programmatic position flows from that. And what's often missing is those programmatic implications and actually taking it seriously. I mean, you know, Harper gave quite a lot of detail. We've documented it a lot about, you know, Russia selling energy at below world market prices, relying on Western technology to extract it. But what you often hear are these impressionistic arguments about Putin's ambitions, the other impressionistic factors like the military. As mentioned, you know, obviously a lot of that is inherited from Soviet times. But that anomaly, that discrepancy between Russia's military and its actual economic abilities in the world confuses a lot of the left, and people rely on these impressionistic arguments. But obviously Marxists don't define nations as imperialist simply because they've got big military powers or imperialist ambitions. And that might sound obvious to some people in this meeting, but as I say, most of the debates that we have, I mean, for example, we were at conferences recently of the Socialist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party. We're hearing categories such as sub-imperialist, regional imperialist, lesser imperialists. You know, on the one hand, that's an acknowledgement that Russia is not on the same footing as, say, the US, Germany, the UK. But on the other hand, it's essentially fudging the issue in order that, you know, so calling states like anything from Saudi Arabia to India imperialist, Saudi Arabia as sub-imperialist, for example, means that you then don't have to take any responsibility when it comes to taking a position in a war, or indeed, if you're even aware of those programmatic implications. Lots of people on the left just arguing, well, we live in an imperialist era, it's just much of a muchness. Often citing Lenin, 1914, without acknowledging that he was talking about an inter-imperialist war. So it begs the question of why we bother. Why are we bothering getting this categorization correct? You know, it's because of the implications for all of our lives. The working class around the world, you know, has an interest in imperialists being defeated. If we're not even getting that categorization correct in the first place, and we're going to be on the wrong side of the barricades in wars like this, the Ukraine-Russia war is the reason why we try to get this right in the first place. Like, otherwise, what's the point? I mean, if people are interested, we've looked at economists like the British economist Michael Roberts, the Australian Marxist Sam King, who, you know, document in detail about why Russia is not imperialist. You know, what is imperialism? Monopoly capitalism, the ability to eliminate all competition in key industries, and Russia is not able to do that. So you'll hear again impressionistic arguments about, you know, the fact that oligarchs exist there, or you know, it's but even its enemies will call it a petrostate. Michael Roberts calls it a one-trick pony. But it's inability to diversify that's part of the problem. It has no advanced technology exports.
Can you wind up?
So I'll just finish with this, which is that, you know, Sam King, I thought, a very convincing statistic that he summarizes it with is talking about Spain as the poorest imperialist state, still earning nearly, even though it's the poorest, it still earns 3 times more than states like Mexico, Brazil, China, Russia, Turkey, twice as much as Argentina, Chile. And he talks about 2 distinct worlds, that even Spain being the weakest imperialist power is still so much more powerful than these other states. And we have to acknowledge that, because all our programmatic conclusions flow from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Roxy. Okay, I've got Catherine. I'll just promote you to a panelist. There you go. Okay, start when you're ready, Catherine. Oh, you just muted yourself. Can you unmute yourself? You need to unmute yourself. You're still muted. Yes, okay.
Okay.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay. To continue on a bit from what Roxy was saying, one of our motivations for holding today's meeting was to address at best the confusion and at worst the cowardice and political bankruptcy of the majority of the other groups that claim the Trotskyist tradition. And really, in a nutshell, the question we have to address, and what Roxy was talking about, is Russia predator or is it prey? Really, that's what it comes down to. And we agree with Michael Roberts' assessment, and he says, Putin may think Russia can be an imperialist power, but the economic reality is that Russia is just a large peripheral economy outside of the US-led imperialist bloc, like Brazil, China, India, South Africa, Turkey, Egypt, etc., even with a larger military than most. So we agree Russia is not imperialist. And you have to ask with the other left groups that claim to be Trotskyist, what came first, the chicken or the egg? A Marxist analysis of the economy of Russia, or an appetite that Russia is not very popular and not something that you want to have to defend? So as such, as Russia is non-imperialist, it's incumbent on revolutionaries to defend Russia militarily against the US NATO war drive intended ultimately to dismember the Russian state. Ukraine, of course, is just being used as a staging ground for this objective. And this is not a war between Russia and Ukraine, but it's a war between Russia and the US NATO imperialist alliance. And of course, while in no way do we give any political support to Putin, we must defend Russia against the predatory imperialists. Our former associates in the IBT, who we had this long debate with for years, hold the position that Russia is an imperialist power. And while they talk with a lot of window dressing about US NATO instigation of the current conflict, they take the position of a pox on both your houses. Jan Norden's internationalist group, which also comes from the Spartacist tradition, has at last climbed down off the fence and now defends Russia, as we do, with the bogus claim that suddenly that quantity had turned into quality. And as far as we're concerned, that nothing has really fundamentally changed since the outset in February. Socialist Action is one of the more confused groups. That they remain neutral on the current conflict, while not objecting to Russia's taking over in the Donbass, intervening in the Donbass. The World Socialist website of David North is very critical of the imperialists, and they note that Russia, on the other hand, intervenes militarily abroad, seeking not colonies for exploitation, but geostrategic guarantees against imperialist intervention. But they remain neutral to this day on the conflict. Likewise, the Trotskyist faction, while recognizing that Russia is not an imperialist power, has succumbed to the never-ending imperialist propaganda barrage against Putin, stating that we must stand firmly against US and NATO imperialism and against Putin's reactionary government, US, NATO, and Russian troops out of Ukraine. Of course, the Cliffites are back to the same old thing, neither Washington nor Moscow, and they oppose both sides. I don't have time to go into some of the other groups, but needless to say, the only group, as I mentioned right now, is the IG that has a similar position to us as Russian defensists. Obviously, this war, winter is coming, and this war clearly reveals that this war launched by the imperialists against Russia clearly reveals the bankruptcy of the capitalist private property system. And what we're going to see is the impoverishment and the immiseration of the masses in North America and in particular Europe very, very soon as a result of this, who are being sacrificed for the gains of the small, greedy imperialists of the United States and NATO.
Thank you. I'll just switch back to attendee. I don't have anyone else indicating they want to speak. Anyone's got a question for Hans-Peter? Or comment on something that anyone said? Maybe while people are thinking about that, do you want to come back on any issues, not as your main summary, but just quickly on any points that have been raised? Hans-Peter?
Sure. I think, yeah, coming back to some of the things that John mentioned and Tom touched upon. So I think US sanctions have had a negative impact also on the US. I was kind of bemused by Joe Biden's journey to Saudi Arabia in August, I think it was, or late July, to meet with the Saudi head of state, who he previously had described as sort of a pariah after Saudi Arabia's killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and Biden said previously that he would never under any circumstances meet with that kind of guy. And so a few months into the conflict, and he comes and goes begging for oil and asks Saudi Arabia to increase to increase oil production to make up for the lack of oil coming out of Russia because of the sanctions that were imposed on them. And similarly to Venezuela, I mean, it's quite a funny one because the US has done everything to bring about regime change there. They try to implement or impose a technocrat, pro-Washington technocrat Juan Guaido there, and even with the British government effectively stole the Venezuelan government reserves. Just said, oh, until Juan Guaido is president, is recognized as official president, we withhold your access to your gold that you deposited in US and British banks. But again, a few months into this conflict, and Biden crawls to Venezuela and begs them to increase oil production. I agree though, the extent of sanctions backfiring on the US is probably to a lesser extent than Europe. Some Marxists, including Michael Hudson, has actually argued that precisely because Europe has been the most negatively impacted by this, Hudson argued even before the outbreak of the hostilities that really what the US was up to was to elbow the European competitors out of the way, whilst in a similar way that US imperialism, whilst being in a military alliance with them, sort of Germany and France and other EU countries, whilst in a similar way that US imperialism treated British and French imperialism after the Second World War, where they forced those two to decolonize effectively, but only to the benefit of US capital. Whether the sanctions certainly have not had such a negative impact on Russia in the short run as the imperialists had hoped.
1 minute.
But if you can believe Michael Roberts, it's mostly in sort of in technology, having access to Western technology and sanctioning these areas where Moscow will be struggling in the long run. And it's unclear whether their alliance with the Chinese, for example, can make up for that in the areas where they need access to machinery and so on. Poland, I'll probably talk about in the summary because there isn't enough time.
Okay. Okay, still don't have anyone indicating to speak. Usually we don't take people who've already spoken until everyone who wants to has had a chance to speak, and as no one else is indicating, if anyone who's already spoken would like to make a subsidiary point, you can put your hand up now. Your virtual hand, that is. Okay, and we'll just go back to Harpe for his main summary.
I think Christoph
Oh,
raised his
Christoph.
hand
Oh,
again.
yep. Oh. Okay, Christoph, I'll just promote you. Okay, just don't. Okay, where you go.
Hi there again. Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple of things about how this conflict has kind of changed the relationship between Washington and Berlin. For many years, obviously, Germany was a very close, solid supporter and ally of US imperialism. And increasingly that is shifting. And I think the Ukraine conflict is really accelerating this. While of course, official statements still are in support of NATO and the fight against evil Russia, there are a lot of back channels that are being worked where Berlin is less keen on simply doing what Washington wants. They have their own interests, and in the last years have increasingly asserted those, whether it is in the form of beefing up its own military and being able to operate abroad, which after the Second World War was of course a big no-no, but under peace missions that was made possible. So that is one shift that we can see. We can also see that Berlin is less keen on signing on to any and all of the wars that the US wants to conduct around the world. And perhaps most strikingly, recently, one of the leading German newspapers basically called for Germany to start producing, establishing, and owning their own nuclear weapons, because you cannot rely anymore on the nuclear shield provided by the United States. That's quite an important development in terms of the German bourgeoisie basically saying, we are not sure you're our friends anymore in the long run, so we're going to get our own weapons. I mean, that's the extent to which the rift between Berlin and Washington is happening. And that is a statement that would have been unthinkable 15 years ago. Now Germany is clearly saying, we can't rely on anybody else to provide nuclear security or whatever you want to call it. Therefore, we need our own weapons of mass destruction. And the fact that this is publicly floated, I think, indicates that this is not just one crazy politician somewhere in parliament, but that is a significant line of thinking amongst the German bourgeoisie, echoed in one of the leading newspapers. I just wanted to call that out. Thanks.
Thanks, Christoph. I'll just make you attendee, and I've got Heiko who wants to speak. I'll just promote you to a panelist, Heiko. Unmute yourself. Okay, when you're ready.
Hello, I'm Heiko from Germany. I'm PT supporter from Germany. In Germany, the situation is that the left is completely out of the game, where the left party is completely weak, more or less following the government in the war question and on every, in the energy question and all the things, just with the remark that it should be more social and more for the poor people, but the rest of it is, it's okay. Putin is a bad guy, and ignore completely the situation in Ukraine and the rise of fascism and following the propaganda in the German media are, you'll see every day the destroyed city of Ukraine and the reporter standing in front of the Kremlin and making some statements about what Putin is now doing, and it's very funny. And the point is that the lack of the left, and that there are no protests, but not really big protests against the rise of energy, but the cost of living, makes the point that the AfD grow up and double their numbers in polls, and together with the rising of the Conservative Party, who normally are in all the questions are more or less on confirmed with the government, but make the point that it's capitalism should be the big point, the German thing, and together it's a very strange situation that we have now a big capitalist crisis, and the right-wing parties are growing and the left are shrinking, and it is very. You have three lefties talking about the war, and no one really has an idea what's going on, just because no one really is saying, okay, Russia is a bad guy, because we hear it every day, 24 hours in the news, and it is strange. And the left parties completely, they have lost every contact to the poor population and to the working class. Surely not all, but there's no, since the crisis came up, there's no sign that they make all these things more social, make all the money the government gave to the poor more social. When there's no rise of the poll for them, and that is because that the leader of the left party are more or less pro-imperialist and pro-NATO and completely following the government in this war question. Okay, that's the point.
Thank you, Heiko. I've got Tom there wanting to speak. I'll just promote you. Okay, Tom, just unmute yourself. You're muted. Good. Away you go.
Yes. Takes a little time. Just a supplementary remark. I think that the question of the configuration of the imperialist world order, which is what we're talking about, largely with Germany, but as we understand, it's also it involves France, it's going to involve Holland and Belgium and et cetera, Western Europe in general, is a very significant development, and one that will take a while to play out. The other thing that's important here that we haven't got a chance to talk about is that the attempt to strangle Russia economically has substantially backfired, and I think in ways that weren't anticipated. I mean, the US imperialists are benefiting from it to some extent because they're able to drain assets from Europe and perhaps also South Korea, et cetera, and restart US industry. And Michael Hudson wrote about that and predicted that from the beginning, from the outset. But the consequences of the economic downturn, and as somebody pointed out, I forget who it is, I mean, here in Canada, for instance, gas prices went up from about $1.10 a liter to $1.70 within 2 or 3 weeks after the outset of this conflict. And I know there was similar impact in the US. Biden tried to keep it down by opening up a strategic reserve. This strategic reserve of oil apparently exists so that Democrats can get elected in midterms. If there was a strategic necessity, the reserves are down substantially. But the impact is, while it may benefit the American and corporate elite, there are certain benefits for them. There are no benefits for ordinary people in North America. Not as severe as Europe, but severe enough. And we see falling living standards in the imperialist heartlands in general as a result of this failed attempt to sanction Russia. And the other thing is that this this impact is being felt in the context of a developing, generalized global capitalist downturn that we are just at the beginning of, that's going to be huge. Rubini has a piece out today, Dr. Doom, predicting that it's going to be the largest, possibly exceed the Great Depression. In any case, everybody can see it coming. All the factors exist, and the disaster in Ukraine economically has just exemplified that. It's produced a rising tide of working class anger across the EU. That's somewhat reflected also in North America, as Jason pointed out. And it seems likely the preconditions exist for some really massive social struggle in the fairly near future. Richard touched on that somewhat. The problem is, of course, the crisis of leadership, and massive social struggle without coherent revolutionary leadership often doesn't produce desired results, and sometimes it can lead in very bad directions. But one of the larger geopolitical results of this is likely to be that NATO and the EU and various other institutions of American global hegemony may not survive this adventure in Ukraine. One of the aspects of that is that momentum is increasing for global trade to take place around and without the intervention of the US dollar. And that's the central pivotal strength of US imperialism in the global system. Once it loses its status as a global reserve currency, once trade takes place without the intermediary of US dollars, the US will lose its status as the global hegemon, and we will reach a point of no return for the American century. And that will be inevitably accompanied by large scale. The consequences of that are going to be accompanied by large scale outbreaks of class struggle in the US that we haven't seen since the 1930s.
Okay.
And I'm finally shutting up.
Yeah. I had seen Stephen there putting your hand up, so a couple of times. Oh no, he's gone. Oh, what? I'm going to promote you. Did want to speak, Stephen?
Yeah, I wanted to speak.
Yep.
Hey, yeah. First of all, yeah. I mean, I on your politics on the situation, I 100% agree with everything you've got from, militarily calling for militarily blocking with Russia, but only conditionally so, insofar as the Russians don't do something like collectively punish Ukrainians arbitrarily, as these things can and do happen in such conflicts. In fact, when the situation broke out at February time, I had no fully formed position because I was a bit naive about the situation. I hadn't really been following things between Russia, Ukraine, and the Donbass area. And then about March, I formulated my position. I didn't read anything that you had put out, and I formulated my position pretty much everything in an alignment with the way you'd formulated it. I was actually I didn't check your press because I was too depressed. I was worried you'd come out with a pox on both your houses position, and that would just make me depressed because I'd be the only person. And I was worried, oh my God, does that mean that everyone's going to think that I'm some kind of closet Putin fanboy and great Russian secret admirer of great Russian chauvinism or whatever. I find it a bit strange that Putin described Lenin as an ultra-nationalist. I don't know if Putin sees himself as more like Catherine the Great. The idea of internationalism for Putin is I don't know exactly, but anyway, that was quite an amusing comment. If you listen to his little speech before, or just at the point that they decided to take more measures in Ukraine. Yeah, I mean, so on just a few remarks, because your politics are very good. I'm not here to criticize your politics in this matter. So I noticed that 20 years ago, when the US was banging the war drums in the Middle East, particularly with Iraq, And that was obviously about preserving, its petrodollar regime because Iraq was threatening that. The right in the US in particular were very gung-ho about it, but here I seem to notice a weird inversion, and I don't know what it is, but a lot of people on the right are actually opposed to this, and it might be to do with the comments you made about Russia being very socially conservative. They might look up to Russia as, oh well, they promote traditionalism and Christianity and strong family values, and they don't really like LGBT and all that kind of stuff, and we're tired of all that in the degenerate West. So let's Putin's we like Putin. He's a great statesman, all the rest of it. So I don't understand that phenomenon too much. Maybe you guys have mulled that over, and but it's certainly something weird I noticed. On the subject of imperialism, I've always been skeptical of the claim that, and Tom basically alluded to this by talking about Tom alluded to this by talking about unipolar order. As you know, about 2008, when the split kicked off, on the beginnings of the split kicked off between the VT and the IBT, I questioned the claim that we could talk about anything more than one independent imperialist power, and I still hold to that view. But I don't describe Germany as an imperialist power. I describe it as a power integrated into an imperialist network run by one imperialist power, namely the US. So I consider it essentially a vassal state. And I don't know, I mean, no independent imperialist power would have accepted what I believe, British imperialism did, destroying not British imperialism. I consider Britain also, by the way, to be a vassal state of the empire. No independent imperialist power would have tolerated that sort of thing, an attack on its own bourgeoisie. Because it was an attack on so obviously an attack on the German proletariat too, but it's and the German bourgeoisie could ride that out, but it's also an attack on German industry in terms of doing that. So I mean, Christoph, yeah, okay.
I'll just finish here.
Yeah, Christoph made the comment that Germany's starting to harden up and isolate off. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the coming years. That's all I was going to say.
Thanks, Stephen. Okay, so I saw that John had his hand up, so I'll just take him as the last speaker before we go back to Hans-Peter for his summary. Okay, I hope you did want to speak there, John. I did see your hand up. Okay, go ahead.
Just briefly to say that there is various little groups scattered about that take a similar position to the one to those expressed here this evening. It seems what would be a useful thing is if we got them in touch with one another. For instance, I attend a group that refers to, that's got a title, and it's a long title, IUAFS, and it's basically International Ukraine Anti-Fascist, and I can't remember what the S stands for, but there we go. And that basically takes a similar position. And also another group called Consistent Democrats, who again take a similar position. Obviously supporting the Allied effort to denazify Eastern Ukraine. So that's it, and I'd just like to say, well, thank you very much to all of the contributors this evening. Some very informed contributions that we've been able to enjoy, and I just wondered if we have time, if Catherine could expand on that list she was reading out earlier and their various assessments. And I'll reiterate my question to Hans: is there a print of or PDF version of his presentation available? Thank you.
Thanks to you, John. Thanks for the contribution. Okay, I've got Catherine there. I'll just take her quickly before. Oh no.
Do you need to de-promote?
Yeah. Sorry about that. Click the wrong name there, Happy. Got rid of you. Kathy, go.
Okay, just very quickly in response to John, I just suggest read our litmus test for Trotskyism, and we do go through most of the left group's position on Ukraine, the Ukraine conflict, and I think that would answer your question rather than me taking the time that Poppy should have. Okay. Benito.
Okay, thank you. I'll just put a link to that in the chat, and but we'll go to Harpe for his summary. Thank you everyone for your contributions. Okay, Harpe, I'll give you about 10 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, we briefly, in response to John, the text, we are discussing whether to publish it, but if not, I can certainly share my notes with you. If I get your email address, I think Alan can probably capture that. On Germany and Steve's last remarks, actually let's kick off with some sections of the libertarian right wing in the US. I suspect that you're right in terms of that sort of socially conservatism that they like about the Putin regime in a way that we wouldn't. Obviously, the whole family religiousness and so on and so forth is more to their liking than sort of the mainstream, particularly the sort of more democratic party and left liberal mainstream in Europe. So I think that would be my explanation as to why the elements. And as far as I know, and I don't really follow that milieu too closely, although some of them have interesting remarks to make in this conflict that are worthwhile reading or following. Colonel McGregor, for example, is certainly no communist, but his analyses on the battlefield situations and so on are worth following. So that's on the libertarian right. German imperialism. So our understanding briefly is that obviously for imperialists to exist as imperialist powers, you need to be able to appropriate in your overall economic relationship with the outside world. You need to be able to appropriate surplus value from other countries' net and not be a net loser on these terms. And I think certainly when I last checked, or certainly Germany, but also when I last checked Britain and so on, were clearly in that field. Britain has become, well, Britain's imperialist power has been sort of struggling, particularly over the last few years. I think on the one hand, the rise of German imperialism in Central Europe has relegated Britain to a role in Europe that has sort of relatively shrunk vis-a-vis Germany, and that's probably partly has been driving the movement towards Brexit and to a stronger alliance with the US. As a result of that, which can be seen, but German imperialism also was critically dependent on that NATO integration, precisely because Germany's army isn't that the strongest. They needed NATO and the NATO framework really to open up Eastern Europe to imperialist exploitation. Particularly the Serbian war comes to mind, with a government of a very similar composition to the one right now, i.e. Social Democrats and the Greens, leading the first war by German imperialism after 1945. So that's kind of partly behind it. The other reason why economically Germany is dependent on that framework is both the EU eastward expansion and so on works or has subjected countries like Poland, the Baltic states, and other Eastern European countries to German to exploitation by German capital. But these countries also in military terms are quite strong US supporters. For example, and that's where we get to Poland. Poland has positioned itself as the energy hub for importing US fracking gas, and has since 2006 pretty much opposed the Nord Stream projects. At the time, the Polish foreign minister in 2006 it was compared the Nord Stream 1 pipeline with as a modern day equivalent with the Hitler-Stalin Pact, as in the Polish bourgeoisie was afraid to be crushed again between Russian dependent capitalism on the one hand and German imperialism on the other. And that's also posed problems to German hegemony, because on the one hand, their German imperialism is dependent on the coherence of the European Union to continue with the degree and level of exploitation that they have been doing. So that's a strong driver towards continuing the transatlantic alliance. On the other, and because if Poland, the Baltic states, and so on, if German imperialism turned decisively to the east, i.e. Russia and China, that they would probably get the support of France and other sort of Western European countries, but that would likely fracture the EU along the lines of the transatlanticist allies of the US, i.e. Poland, Baltic states, and so on the one hand, Britain, and the core EU on the other. So that would have potential important consequences for profitability of German imperialism as well. But to this date, at least, the German imperialism has been able to a large extent to play a big role and an increased role since 1991. So it's clearly an imperialist country. More on Poland and in the Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine has been a multinational state. The current borders of the Ukrainian state, or even the 2014 borders of the Ukrainian state, haven't existed or are relatively new. They're mostly, most of it has not really existed as a Ukrainian state since the 1920s. Sort of the whole arch of the Donbass, which is majority dominated by Russian speakers and people who to some degree or other identify as some sort of Russian, was added to the Ukrainian state within the Soviet Union, the framework of the Soviet Union in the early 1920s. There's a very interesting presentation by John Mearsheimer from around 2015 or so, at the beginning of the post-Maidan conflict, where he breaks down the Ukrainian territory and sort of identifies the areas that and their sort of historical background. then on the other hand, the areas around Lviv and so on, which is today a stronghold of Polish ultranationalism and fascism,
2 minutes.
was part of Poland until 1945. So that's partly where the Polish government. So the Polish government has been trying to portray itself. It's there's been a recent other interesting article in Politico where the Polish government has announced that it's going to grow its army to 300,000 strong. It's already started to purchase weaponry from South Korea to lay claim. It's made announcements to lay claim, possibly to the parts of Western Ukraine that used to be Poland prior to 1945. It's also present in Ukraine with a lot of mercenaries, parts of the Polish army that apparently operate as undercover Ukrainian parts of the army, but the influx of mercenaries was kind of importance for the Ukrainian army's successful offensive around August, September time. And Polish troops played a big part in that. And whether officially NATO is not part of the conflict, down to diplomacy, partly because if there were an acknowledged party of the conflict, you know, the likelihood of a nuclear exchange would increase dramatically. That was partly the danger that occurred when a Ukrainian air defense missile hit Polish territory. But
the time wind up.
Maybe 2 more sentences.
Yep.
And the Polish government in that incident at first reacted by actually saying, yes, it was a Russian missile. So the Polish government is very gung-ho about trying to prepare the ground for a potential land grab of Western Ukraine, in rushing in and taking it before the Russian troops can. On the other hand, Russia has made it very clear that should there be an open NATO presence in Ukraine, that will likely turn the conflict into one between NATO and the bigger NATO and Ukraine. And if the incidents with the Ukrainian air defense missile is anything to go by, the US and leading EU imperialist powers have no interest in risking the extermination of humanity via nuclear war. Fundamentally, though, I agree with Richard. The perspective we have for solving this crisis is one of international working class solidarity, building a revolutionary party internationally that can coordinate strikes not only on a national level but internationally. And the pointer towards the ILWU strikes against the war in Iraq in 2008, May Day, the US West Coast, but also those of Greek and Italian workers earlier this year against NATO weapons shipments to Ukraine, are sort of pointers in the right direction that just need to be systematized and sort of cohered into a framework of a revolutionary party with a program that can, beyond these mostly symbolic actions, turn them into a strategic offensive of the international working class with the goal of international workers' revolution.
Thank you, Hans-Peter. And thanks to everyone else who spoke during the discussion. And I hope everyone here found the meeting informative and useful. As I mentioned at the beginning, we had been recording and we will be putting up a audio recording, no video, of the presentations and the whole discussion, and that should be up on our website, bolsheviktendency.org, in a couple of days. Thank you all for coming, and have a nice afternoon or evening, depending on where you are.